In this episode, I'm going to be talking about the case of Brianna Ghey. Now, the two defendants have just recently been sentenced in the last few days and have been sentenced to life imprisonment. Now, this case is quite controversial because of the age of the two murderers at the time. Now, this is one of those cases that shocked the nation. Even though it wasn't massively publicised, I hadn't actually seen it on the news myself whilst it happened. But I did, when I was researching up on other videos, this is when it came to light. And a couple of my subscribers have been following the case and they've asked us if I could cover it. But it was already in the pipeline and I was already going to cover the case. So that's the story I'm talking about today. Now, the two defendants were 15-year-old at the time, and it was Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe, and they were convicted for the murder of Brianna Ghey. Now, cases like this are quite rare, as in, normally, in cases like this, you maybe get one perpetrator, but when the two of them come up with a plan to do something horrific like this together, it is quite unusual. Now, we'll delve into a bit about the case before I go on to talk about what life will be like for them in prison. So the teenagers got together and had a list of 4 people that they were going to kill. Now, for two 15-year-olds to do something like this and come up with a plan and plot murder at the age of 15 is, like I mentioned, very rare and unusual, because it's not very often two 15-year-old kids get together and decide to go on a killing spree. Now, before they actually killed Brianna, there was another intended victim, and the other intended victim was another boy, and the boy, luckily for him, didn't fall for the trap, because these two had set up a fake social media profile trying to draw the boy out so they could then kill him. And what's also unusual about this case is the fact that Scarlett Jenkinson and Brianna were friends from the age of 11. Now, when I've read up on the case and looked into it, it seems as though Scarlett got quite obsessed with Brianna, and the reasons why she said she wanted to kill her was because she wanted to feel close to her and she wanted to have that power over her, knowing she had took her life. Now, Eddie Ratcliffe hadn't even met Brianna before this attack happened. The day of the murder was the first time Eddie had actually met Brianna Ghey, and Scarlett was the one who got the biggest sentence. She got life with a minimum term of 22 years, and Eddie got life with a minimum of 20 years, because the judge went on to say that Scarlett was the ringleader of this crime, and she was the one that had the most power and the most say in what had happened. But what I'll do before I go a little bit more into the case, I'll show you some footage here of when they were arrested, and they got arrested not long after the murder. And there's loads of footage along the way where the two defendants met up and took Brianna and took her on the walk to her death. I'll have a look at the footage now.
How come you're a suspect?
Because I'm the last person that's seen her, is it?
I can't explain it.
No, listen.
Right, listen.
You Eddie?
Yeah.
Eddie, you're locked up suspicion of murder, alright?
You are under arrest on suspicion of murder.
You don't have to say anything, but you may harm your defence if you don't mention when questioned. See you later on in court, and if you do say evidence, do you understand?
Yeah, let's just unlock these. Scarlett, this is what I've got to say.
Yeah.
At this moment.
Now, when I said that it didn't take long for them to arrest them after the murder, this goes to show how immature as well they still were at 15-year-old, even though they were committing such an horrendous and heinous crime like this. When the police went to search the properties, in Scarlett's house, they found the letter, the handwritten letter of when she planned the murder, planning the people that she was going to kill. There was thousands of text messages backwards and forth between the pair, saying how they wanted to kill Brianna, why they wanted to do it, and what they were going to do. So the two defendants met up with Brianna in Culcheth Linear Park in Warrington, and they went on a walk into the park, and they even had a signal for when they were going to start the attack. So when they were plotting this, they came up with a code word which was Ghey, and this was to start the attack. So when they said the code word, the pair went on to attack, and Eddie stabbed her some 28 times. But in the text messages and the handwritten note, Scarlett had said she wanted to get the last stab. She wanted to be the one that stabbed her last, and this is what happened. But when the police went and raided the houses, there was no forensics on Scarlett's clothes like there was all over Eddie's. But that was because Scarlett had said she'd washed her clothes. But when they were arrested, they both blamed each other. So they were speaking about the murder, but they were blaming each other, trying to minimise their guilt. But they were only stopped by two dog walkers walking through the park after they'd stabbed her 28 times. There was two dog walkers coming through the park, and this was the reason they stopped their attack, or they probably would have went on to stab her more times. But there is something about the case that I didn't mention earlier on, and that is that Brianna, if anyone has been following the case, Brianna Ghey is a transgender, and she has been from a very early age. And some of the reasons behind it that the police were given, and the reason why they think she become a target and why they killed her, was because she was transgender. But whatever people think and whatever people's thoughts are on transgenders, nobody, especially a 15-year-old, deserves to be murdered in this sort of way. But when Scarlett was assessed by a psychiatrist, it went on, or the psychiatrist went on to say that she had a severe form of conduct dissocial disorder, and one of the features which is having no empathy, meaning she probably has no feelings about guilt or anything, and this is probably one of the reasons, or the main reason, why she could go on to commit such an act. But Eddie Ratcliffe was also diagnosed with autism, and the judge said that he accepted that his social skills were not as developed as most other people his age. But he did go on to say that that's no excuse for doing what they've done. But what I'll do now, I'll play you a little bit of the sentence's remarks from the judge when the two were sentenced. Then after that, I'll tell you a little bit about what I think will happen to them in prison.
I have weighed all the aggravating and mitigating factors that apply to each of you. Although I have taken the same starting point, I have concluded that the final minimum terms must be different. In Scarlett's case, the aggravating features are significant and would have led to a substantial uplift to the starting point, but for the mitigation, particularly that relating to maturity and mental disorder. There must still be an uplift, but it will be moderated. In Eddie's case, I find that the balance to be struck between aggravating factors, which are not quite as high as in Scarlett's case, and the mitigation I have identified is such as to cancel each other out. In saying that, I have taken account of all the medical evidence and accept the diagnosis of ASD has some impact, but the extent to which it reduced your culpability in the circumstances of this offending is limited. This was undoubtedly a very serious offence with multiple aggravating factors. That is the context in which I impose minimum terms which are lengthy for offenders of your age, albeit significantly less than an equivalent sentence for an adult. The parole board will have to decide if and when either or both of you can be released. That will only happen if you no longer pose a danger. If you are released, you will remain on licence for life and you may be recalled to prison. I will now sentence each of you. You may remain seated. In both cases, the relevant statutory surcharge will apply. Scarlett Jenkinson, for the murder of Brianna Ghey, you will be detained at His Majesty's pleasure. I set the minimum term at 22 years, less the 352 days that you have spent on remand. Eddie Radcliffe, for the murder of Brianna Ghey, you will be detained at His Majesty's pleasure. I set the minimum term at 20 years, less the 352 days that you have spent on remand.
So as you can see by the judge's sentencing, Scarlett was sentenced to life with a minimum of 22 years and Eddie was sentenced to life with a minimum of 20 years. Now, the minimum tariff doesn't mean they will be released from prison once they've served it, but if in the meantime they get all the courses done and they prove that they're no longer a risk, then the possibility of parole is eligible. But for me, I think when Scarlett goes into prison and she's with the other prisoners, she won't get much of a hard time for what she done. And the reasons why I give that is because when she's mixed in with the other teenagers her age, they will be in fear of her because of what she's done and the crime that she's in for. And because the teenager was the same age as her, it would be different if it was an older person doing it to a younger kid. But because they were the same age and they're going to be mixed in with kids their same age, because at the end of the day, they are still kids at that age. They're now 16-year-old, so people can't say, well, they're not referred to as kids. But when you look back to when you were 16, you're still what you would class as immature and not an adult or a fully grown adult. So I think Scarlett, maybe she will have a hard time in prison. I'm not saying that everybody who's doing a life sentence has a hard time at some point throughout the sentence. But then again, with this disorder that she has, when she feels no empathy, she could be going through the prison system in a daze, in a haze, and not even contemplating what she's done and just getting on with that time. But she will, at times throughout the sentence, have a hard time. People will try and attack her and bully her, but I don't think she'll be attacked because of the crime she's in for. Because like I mentioned, she'll be looked upon as someone to be feared when she's mixed in with other people her age who are in for thefts, shoplifting, these type of offences. But Eddie, on the other hand, if with his autism, he might be a shy, quiet type of person, even though he's a murderer that's committed this horrific offence, I think people will, or lads his age, will test him, will try him, because that's what happens in the young offender prisons. Because that's where you'll be at, in a young offender prison with kids aged between 15 to 18. Because in young offenders, the kids aged 15 to 18 are separated from the other lads who are between the ages of 18 and 21. But in the young offender prisons, violence is rife. But a lot of the other kids might be wary of Eddie because of what he's in for. He stabbed somebody 28 times. And if anybody in prison starts picking on Eddie, they're going to be thinking to themselves, is Eddie going to come back and attack me? Is he going to go and get a knife? So they might be a bit more wary of Eddie inside the prisons. But again, he'll not have an easy time. It points throughout his sentence, he will be feeling depressed, probably a lot of the time. So don't be thinking they're going to be having an easy time in prison. They've got a long stretch ahead of them. Being 16-year-old, having 20 years or 22 years ahead of you is a very long time to think of. But a lot of people will be saying they deserved a lot longer for what they've done. They've done horrific murder. But that's up to the debate of every single person, because everyone's got their own freedom of choice, freedom of speech. But I just wanted to cover this case because a few people in the comment section have been talking about it, and it is a high profile case, even though at the time I don't think it was as high profile as it should have been, because I can't recall saying this when it happened. And this might have been because there was a blanket on the names of the two defendants that were referred to as, I can't remember, it might have been A and B, something similar, but they lifted the restrictions, and that's why they were now allowed to be named, because I think under the ages of 16, there's some sort of law where they can't name them in the papers until they get found guilty, and then the 16, which is happening with it now. But I just wanted to clear a few things up, give you my version on events, and hopefully you enjoyed that, people, because like I've mentioned, a few people wanted to hear about it, hear my thoughts on it, and I didn't really say much about my thoughts, but what I will say on it is an horrific crime. Two 15-year-old kids shouldn't be sitting plotting on murdering their friends, especially someone who was the friend from being 11-year-old. It just goes to show how sick and twisted these two individuals are. So that's my thoughts on it. I think the two sick individuals coming up and plotting, killing their friends. I've got a son who's 12-year-old, and I would dread to think that some kids were plotting up to kill him. It could have been anybody's kid. They were plotting to kill four other kids. Now, for two teenagers to come up with sick stuff like this, it's never really heard of in the UK. Yes, sometimes in America, you hear about these sort of stories, but not over here in the UK. But I will talk a lot more on child murderers on my channel. But again, people, if you are enjoying the content, remember to comment, like, and subscribe. Take care, people, and enjoy the rest of your day.